Textual Criticism, Introduction. This is the first of 5 slideshows that are going to introduce you to the science of textual criticism. We can define textual criticism as the science that seeks to determine the history and relationships of manuscripts for certain writings. And this involves two different things. On the one hand, it involves an explanation of the history of copying biblical texts, how and why new readings arose, and what relationships there are between the manuscripts. Secondly, it involves determining the likeliest original reading of non-extant texts. Now, we're mostly interested in this second aspect of textual criticism because our goal is to look at the various manuscript evidence that we have and determine what the likeliest original reading was in order to establish the Greek text so that we can get on with translating it and interpreting it. We have a lot of evidence that can help us establish what the likely original reading was of our New Testament books. We have at least some 5,735 Greek manuscripts and lectionaries. In actual fact, we have more, but these are what have been identified so far. We also have ostraca, that is potsherds or pieces of pottery that have had a scripture passage on them. Talismans, that might be a piece of jewelry worn around the neck, for example, with some scripture passage on it or in it. And then citations. Take, for example, the early church fathers writing some kind of a document and wanting to quote from the Old Testament or New Testament, and they would use whatever Bible manuscripts that they had. And that also becomes evidence for us, actually very good evidence, because we can date when that writing of the scripture passage was known, because we know when the church fathers lived. And so this is also evidence. We can break this down in the next slide, but before we move on, let's just take note of how this trustworthy tradition of our New Testament manuscripts is a very strong tradition. It's better than the classical writings or Old Testament manuscripts, better by far. For example, Homer's Iliad has some 700 Greek manuscripts, and Euripides' Tragedies is in 300 Greek manuscripts from the Byzantine period. And then Tacitus's Latin Annals exist in just one manuscript that comes from the 9th century. Here is a table that is taken from Bruce Metzger's Text of the New Testament, the 2nd and 3rd edition evidence that he listed, and then the expansion of that work by Bart Ehrman in 2005, the 4th edition of the Text of the New Testament. Now note that the 2005 edition is citing evidence as it existed back in 2003, so that's some years back already, and that's why I say that there has been some additional evidence that we are aware of and are still documenting. So, for example, in 1968, we knew of 81 papyri with New Testament passages or books on it. And in 1989, that number moved up to 96. And then in the 2003 evidence cited in the 2005 edition of the Text of the New Testament, we were up to 116. Now, the ostraca evidence hasn't been reported since 1968. Uncials are early manuscripts that were written in capital letters. And so the uncial evidence has also been moving up from 266 to 299, now to 310. Minuscules is a handwriting that came in the 8th or 9th century, and so we can distinguish uncials up until that time, and then minuscules from the 8th or 9th century on, up until the time of the printing press being invented in the 15th century. The minuscule evidence has also increased from 2,754 to 2,812 to 2,877. What I haven't mentioned so far is evidence from church lectionaries. If a lectionary were developed for a church service, then scripture passages would have been written in the lectionary. And so that evidence has also increased, as you can see from the table. What isn't mentioned here is the additional evidence from the church fathers, which is far too much to try to tabulate in a table. But here, then, we can say that in 2003, we have had evidence of 5,735 pieces of witness to the New Testament. Now, that doesn't mean that every single one of those was a witness to all of our present New Testament. Sometimes it's only to a verse or even part of a verse, but this is the total of evidence that we were able to work with some years back now. The strength of this manuscript witness also has to do with date. The earlier the evidence, the better. It's true that we have these many manuscripts, but a large number of them come from considerably later, centuries later, than the actual New Testament documents were written. However, some of the evidence is quite early. In fact, P52, which refers to papyrus number 52, is a part of John's Gospel, and maybe only 25 years after the Gospel was actually written, sometime in the early 2nd century. We have two very important and elegant parchment manuscripts that come to us from around about AD 300, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The weakest evidence is for the Apocalypse of John. It's found in only 287 Greek manuscripts, and only 10 of these are majuscules or uncials, that is, these earlier manuscripts where capital letters were used. 3 of these are only 1 leaf each, rather than the entire Apocalypse. So that's our poorest evidence, and yet still it's better than a lot of the other classical writings that we have manuscripts for today. On the other hand, the Gospel of Luke is very well attested, and Acts is substantially longer in one whole manuscript tradition that we call the Western textual tradition than another. So it's an interesting thing to compare this Western textual tradition of Acts to the other manuscripts that we have. And one more point here is that the diversity of possible readings do not shake any theological or ethical conviction of the Orthodox Christianity. Often the evidence is whether or not to add the word the or and, or a difference between a present tense or a past tense verb or something like that. Sometimes the word is just an alternative word for the same thing. And so the evidence is, the differences are not all that important, usually. And even when they are rather interesting differences, they are nevertheless not something that's going to change your theology or your ethics as an Orthodox Christian. That's a very important point to make, because sometimes people like to point out the fact that we don't have any of the original manuscripts, and then they try to build from there to make it sound as if Christianity is based on some very shaky foundation of the manuscript tradition. But in actual fact, the truth is exactly the opposite. We can be very certain about the witness that we have. Now, textual criticism is still important, and that's why we're learning to do this in interpreting the New Testament. The importance of textual criticism, then. Firstly, some textual issues are significant, even if not significant for our convictions and practices. Two passages that might be mentioned here as examples are the ending of Mark's Gospel and the passage in John's Gospel that has to do with the woman caught in adultery. Both of these passages have very weak manuscript evidence to attest to them, and scholars just do not think that this ending of Mark is the original, or that the story of the woman caught in adultery was originally a part of John's Gospel. They're later additions. Given the importance of Scripture for the church, our conviction is that the more accurate the text, the better it is. And so we need to do our best job to identify what the original reading was, and then base our theology, our practices, our preaching, our teaching on those manuscripts. And of course, our translations need to come from establishing the right textual reading of these manuscripts. That is a point that needs to be made with respect to one development in recent times. The New King James Version is a translation that is basically just an alteration of the old King James Version, written hundreds of years ago. Now, when the original King James Version of the Bible was written, or translated, I should say, it was translated from the best manuscript tradition at that time. You can see, though, even from this introductory lecture, that we have continued to develop our understanding of the textual tradition. And so we have far better evidence today than we did several hundred years ago. Translations, then, should show these differences. The New King James Version was a desire to continue in the same tradition of the original King James tradition of textual evidence. The result being that we have a very poor translation because of the bad textual evidence that is used, and we should not be using the New King James Version. Some important dates that should be noted in textual criticism are the following. Beginning in the 8th century, punctuation in the text was introduced. So here we have the fact that originally punctuation was hardly ever present in the text, and that can lead to it's one of the reasons why we have sometimes different readings. Imagine just writing without any breaks between words, without any commas or periods, and also, for that matter, without any chapters or verses. Inevitably, this would be a reason why sometimes copying of manuscripts would lead to some errors. Beginning in the 9th century, we have a different handwriting used in order to write more quickly. And so you move in this time period from the majuscules or uncials, where capital letters were used, to the minuscules, where a kind of cursive handwriting was used, where the pen did not have to lift off the page very often, and therefore you could copy things faster. This is helpful for us in textual criticism in order to date manuscripts. You can see a minuscule rather clearly from an uncial, as we will see later in this lecture. Now, in the 1450s, Gutenberg invented the printing press, and now we are able to move from a tradition of hand copying of manuscripts to printing. So textual criticism largely refers to what went on up until the time of Gutenberg's printing press, where the errors could eventually be done away with, and we could have a clean text that could just be printed over and over again. Not long later, in 1514, we had the first printing of a Greek New Testament. And 2 years later, we have the first publication of a Greek New Testament by Erasmus, and a second publication of the Greek New Testament, a second edition of that in 1519, which Luther then used to translate the New Testament into German. The first publication of a Greek New Testament in 1516 was done by Erasmus, and Erasmus continued his work as he was able to get a hold of new manuscripts. His initial work was based on only about 7 manuscripts. Jumping several centuries later, we come to the 19th century where some very important work was done in textual criticism. Konstantin Tischendorf worked on 8 different editions of the Greek New Testament, and he is considered the discoverer of a very important, if not the most important, Greek manuscript of the New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus, found at St. Catherine's Monastery in their library by Tischendorf. 2 very well-known textual critics were Westcott and Hort, and their Greek New Testament edition of 1881 overthrew what was called the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus was an early 17th century work, that is early 1600s, that claimed to have discovered what the received text of the church is and ought to be. But it was based on very few manuscripts. This Textus Receptus is what lies behind the King James translation. Westcott and Hort proposed that there were actually 3 different textual traditions that could be identified, what are called text types. A Syrian or Byzantine text type that would be for the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Then there's a Western text type, and then what they called a neutral text type, and they meant by that what is likely the text type that represents most accurately the original writings of our New Testament, the original manuscripts. And in particular, they claimed that Codex Vaticanus is an excellent example of this neutral text type, a manuscript that was found in the Vatican Library, and so it got the name Codex Vaticanus. You're familiar with one of the resources because it's a textbook for this course, the text of the New Testament that went through several editions by the text critic from Princeton University, Bruce Metzger, and then one of his last students, Bart Ehrman, picked up the editing of this textbook, and so his name is now associated with this as well. Another similar type of book comes to us in English translation from a German edition by Kurt and Barbara Alland, called The Text of the New Testament as well. Both of these have a good discussion of what textual criticism is, the history of textual criticism, and how to go about it. In addition to that, you have Gordon Fee's New Testament exegesis that has a chapter on how to do textual criticism. Gordon Fee was himself a textual critic, as well as writing many other works as a New Testament scholar. And then finally, Bruce Metzger's A Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament should be something you're aware of as well. This work has an introduction that covers the method of textual criticism, which we've already noted is to be found in Gordon Fee, as well as the works by Metzger and Ehrman, and by the Alans. So yet another resource telling you how to go about doing textual criticism. This work by Bruce Metzger, the Textual Criticism of the Greek New Testament, is a work that you can probably find as a resource on an electronic search program like BibleWorks. And so you might have that available if you have some kind of electronic search program like that. The other thing that Bruce Metzger's textual commentary in the Greek New Testament does is it goes through examples of how a committee decided what the original reading probably was based on all the manuscript evidence that they looked at. And so it doesn't cover every textual problem in the New Testament, but it covers some significant ones. Significant not because it makes a big difference to us, but rather they're significant textual problems, difficult ones, ones that are interesting, and sometimes ones that can lead to a different interpretation of a passage. So these are some resources for textual criticism that I'd put before you. With these resources, you can begin to go about doing textual criticism with your Greek New Testament, your critical edition of the Greek New Testament that you would have purchased for beginning Greek.